It's very good to have you all here. The thing that I just want to say at the beginning is just a reminder that this seminar is being offered as a kind of donation event. So everyone, in order to join, has paid a small £5 sort of booking fee. But yeah, do consider donating more and generously if you can. And we'll say more about that as the days goes on. So until Friday, we'll be meeting at this time every day with Dharmarati, who's going to take us through the Satipatthana Sutta. I'm not sure yet how he's going to do that, so will be a surprise to me as well as you, and maybe even to him. But Dharmarati, I've only known Dharmarati about 6 months, but I've often had a few chats with him about either the Satipatthana Sutta or the Anapanasati. It's definitely an area that he's really interested in and gives a lot of time to. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say this week, Dharmarati. But just before I hand over to you, I forgot that I'm supposed to introduce Caroline. So I'm going to be hosting this each day, apart from on Thursday, when Caroline will be the host. Do you want to say hello?
Hello, lovely to see you all. Lovely familiar faces, many of you. And look forward to seeing those of you who I'm not so familiar with on Thursday.
So you've probably heard from Caroline already, because she deals with the bookings here at Asthana. But yeah, without further ado, let's hand over to you, Dharmarati. I will de-spotlight myself and the spotlight will just be on you. So yeah, over to you, Dharmarati.
Right, I'm delighted the spotlight isn't on me and my screen. It means I get to see everybody. So welcome to everybody. Some faces I know very well, some faces I know very well and haven't seen for some years, and some people I'm seeing for the first time. So everybody's welcome. Part of my background reading for this, I was looking at a thing that Bhikkhu Thanissaro has written on the Satipatthana Sutta, and he quotes the Buddha saying that you could study the Satipatthana for 100 years and not exhaust it. So it's a little bit ambitious trying to do 4 one-hour sessions. We might not quite fully exhaust the text. On the other hand, at the end of the text, can't remember if it's the Pali rendition of it or one of the Chinese renditions, it starts off saying, if you practice it for 7 years, forget 7 years if you practice it for 7 months, forget 7 months if you practice it for 7 days. And then I think one of the Chinese translations goes one step further and says, if you practice it for 7 hours, you'll see immediate results. So somewhere between 100 years and 7 hours, we might manage to get enough information to do something useful with the text. There's something in that, I think. I hope we've got time to do a little bit of reflection practice. I think it's literally true that you can get the benefit of Satipatthana practice almost immediately. You know, just if you take the first practice that's recommended in the body section of the sutta, which is just to follow the breath. You know, even if you do it right now, just sort of tune into the breath, let the breath connect you to your body, pay a little bit of attention to that, and you've immediately, at least on a good day for some of us, a bit of a shift in the quality of our experience, a bit of a shift in the quality of our connection to ourselves. So I think this idea of a few hours practice making a difference, you might not quite get to the realization of Nibbana, but at least you're going to be measurably, tangibly better connected to your experience. So what I'm going to hope we're going to do in these sort of few hours that we have, partly this has come out of us at Adhisthana thinking a little bit, learning some lessons even from the last year of being locked down. And we've been in the habit of offering retreats, some very, very well taught retreats by some very experienced teachers, but it's been so difficult to do in the last year or so that we've started to have an online component to a lot of our retreats. And I'm embarrassed at how long it's taken the penny to drop, but realizing that doing that, you can reach a much wider audience than you can for the people who are free to attend Adhisthana for 10 days. So kind of building on that, what we've tried to do is, this is a bit of a build up to a retreat that I'm involved in with Vidyamala and Sona in August. But we wanted to kind of try and at least give a bit of a taster of the Satipatthana Sutta, sort of what it is, where it's kind of pointing us to in our practice, and do that in a way that gave people at least a little glimpse of where the Sutta's trying to take us and sort of suggesting we take our attention. So I'm doing 4 sessions this week. Sona's going to do 4 lead meditations next week. So both in terms of a bit of, as it were, theory and a bit of practice, but we'll get a bit of a sense of the shape of the Satipatthana Sutta. So it's a distinguished audience. I'm looking at Vajra Devi in the bottom left-hand corner of my screen. Vajra Devi has recently written a very good book on Satipatthana practice, so it's completely daunting for me speaking to somebody who knows the subject better than I do. So let's just imagine this is an exploration mutually, a sharing of experience. And if I go too far wrong, you're invited to chip in and keep us all on the straight and narrow. So the Satipatthana Sutta, there's 2 versions of it in the Pali Canon. And most of us probably will be most familiar, if we're familiar with the text at all, we'll know it from the Pali Canon version. There's a Majjhima Nikaya version, Majjhima Nikaya 10, and there's a longer Digha Nikaya. Digha Nikaya is the longer discourses in the Pali Canon. And the big difference between the 2 versions of the Satipatthana Sutta is that the Digha Nikaya version unpacks the 4 noble truths more. They're dealt with more briefly in the Majjhima Nikaya version. There are also 2 versions of the Satipatthana Sutta in Chinese translation, and those Chinese translations also come from early Indian sources. And the 3 versions, that they're recognizably the same teaching, but the kind of selection of material, the ordering of the material varies a bit between them. So there's overlaps between the 3 recensions of the text, and all of them are probably from roughly the same sort of period. So it's not that the Pali recensions an earlier one, they're probably really contemporary renderings of the text. Bit of variation, but a shared core of teaching. The etymology of it, if you're interested, I kind of love stuff like this, because quite often the Pali gives you clues to what's being got at. The English rendering is always a bit of an approximation. So sati is easy. Sati is mindfulness. And over the next few days, we'll say a bit more about what the quality of experience that sati is trying to describe and trying to evoke is. Second part of it is the Pali word is patthana, so you get satipatthana. The traditional etymology of that comes from the Pali commentarial tradition. And the traditional etymology comes from a word that means to make firm or foundation. So quite often the Satipatthanas are translated as the foundations of mindfulness. But modern scholarship, especially looking at the different recensions of the text, are suggesting a different etymology. And the etymology that modern scholarship is going for is that the second word comes from a Pali word that means to stand beside or to attend to. So you get this idea that what Satipatthana is getting at is this idea of taking awareness into bringing it close to attending to these 4 areas of experience. And the 4 areas are body, feelings, mind, and dhammas, which to translate that as objects of mind. So it's everything that the mind can attend to. And Bhante describes it as taking aware positivity into the whole spectrum of human experience. So what you're trying to do with the Satipatthana Sutta is take this aware positivity or positive awareness into the whole spectrum of our experience. I remember when I was a young order member, just getting involved in Triratna, coming across this little one-line aphorism of Sangharakshita's, which is awareness is revolutionary. And what's being suggested in this text is this act of taking awareness into those dimensions of experience as a fundamental change in the quality of our experience. And the text certainly gives you a sense of that. So let's have a little look at the text. So it starts off, on one occasion, the Blessed One was living in the Kuru country, a town of the Kurus named Kamasadama. And if you don't mind, I'm going to pause there for a minute. You can still find the situation, the location where the Buddha gave the Satipatthana Sutta. And it's in a municipal park in the south of Delhi. Nobody in the neighborhood knows where it is. I spent half a day trying to find this site of the Satipatthana Sutta. And the reason it probably is the site is that it's marked by an Ashokan inscription. And the Ashokan inscription is maybe 150, 200 years after the sutta itself was given. And there's a big slab in this public park on a rock on the top of a little hill that says, this is where the Buddha gave the Satipatthana Sutta. And it's not beyond belief, I think, that an oral tradition lasting 150 or a couple of hundred years would have remembered where that sutta was given. It's a really lovely little spot, still a nice public park. There's this rocky outcrop, and if you were looking for a place to give a teaching to a collection of bhikkhus, this is the rocky outcrop that you might well sit on. And Delhi Municipal Council have built this totally utilitarian concrete shed around the Ashokan pillar. So you've got this antique pillar on an outcrop of rock in this absolutely utilitarian concrete municipal building, keeping it protected from the weather. But what's also lovely is that over the years, pilgrims have found the site, I'm guessing they're Thai or Burmese pilgrims, that they've started to gold leaf the concrete. So this concrete shed is gradually having gold leaf rubbed on it. And there's something about, I love the metaphor of that you've got something so ordinary gradually being transformed into something extraordinary. So if you want a little metaphor for how mindfulness starts to change your experience, the Delhi Municipal Concrete Shed might work for the duration of these lectures at least. So the Buddha goes on, monks, this is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of dukkha and discontent, for acquiring the true methods for the realization of nibbana. And then he goes on, namely the 4 Satipatthanas. And I want to take this kind of seriously. I think one of the things that's extraordinary about this practice and about this presentation of the Dharma is that it could not start off any more ordinary or any more practical. So, practice that all of you are totally familiar with the becoming aware of the breath, taking breath into the body. So it starts off as concrete and as accessible as that. And as the text goes on, it's almost like step by step, it's just taking awareness more and more deeply into experience until literally you're starting to look at the fundamental conditions that cause suffering. And you're starting to look at the fundamental conditions that liberate us from suffering. So this idea that we're looking at a path that leads to, as the text says, the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, disappearance of dukkha and discontent, and acquiring nibbana. It's not overstating it to say that the sutra gives us a map of where we take our awareness to support that deepening process of liberation, of awakening. So let's have a look at the text itself. Actually, I'll maybe spend a little bit of time just trying to unpack even that little verse. And this is where you get the idea that you could spend 100 years on this and not quite have exhausted it. But the direct path is translating a bit of Pali that is, the word is ekayano. So it means like one path. It could mean direct path. Ek is just the word for one. Yana, you'll know, is sort of vehicle path. So it's the direct path. And what does that mean when it says this attending to the four Satipatthanas is the direct path for overcoming suffering and realization of nibbana? Again, it's a very kind of setting the bar pretty high, and I'm sort of interested in what it means. Bante's comment on this is that there are some texts that really unpack all of the key elements of the path. There are some teachings that do that. Now, one of the points that Bante makes is about how flexible the Dharma is. He says that there's no single teaching that works for every temperament under every condition. The Dharma went to so much trouble, the tradition went to so much trouble to articulate the experience, how we access that experience in so many ways, in so many languages, and so many approaches. So it's not something dogmatic that's being said. It's not saying this is the only way to nibbana. But one of the sort of Bante's comments on this is that different texts take the fundamental principles of the path and present them in a way from their own particular perspectives, from their own particular point of view. And this is the fundamental shape of the path from suffering to liberation from suffering, from the point of view of mindfulness, with mindfulness in the center of that mandala, and that as a doorway into an examination of the conditions that in a way support that unfolding of the path. If I can mix my metaphors. On the other hand, in the Pali tradition at least, this idea of the direct path only refers to the Satipatthanas. So it puts a lot of emphasis on the significance of mindfulness and how central mindfulness is to that, the conditions that support awakening. As Bante says, you get it in so many different formulations of the Dharma. You'll get it in the 5 faculties, 7 factors of enlightenment, the 8-fold path. You'll get it in the Vajrayana tradition. You'll get it in the Chan tradition. This idea of mindfulness is one of the key components of liberation. It just runs through the whole tradition. So although it's not an exclusive description of the path, it's a very, very central one to the whole tradition. So that's the direct path. And I was reading a writer from the Tibetan tradition, a guy called Alan Wallace, who writes from, I think, the sort of Kagyu tradition. He was writing about the Satipatthana Sutta. He was making the same point about how central mindfulness is to the Mahamudra, Dzogchen strands of Tibetan practice, but saying that he thinks the Satipatthana Sutta is the clearest unpacking of how and why mindfulness is so central. So it was interesting reading that from someone who's mainly located in the Tibetan tradition. So in Bante's commentary, he goes on that it's the path for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation. And the main point that he makes here is that the Buddhist approach is profoundly optimistic. So you're getting, again, this description of the conditions that cause suffering. And then you're getting this description of the conditions that liberate from suffering. So it's not, again, this is very familiar ground. It's not a kind of fatalistic acceptance of suffering. It's just realizing that suffering, like every other phenomenon, arises in dependence on conditions. We can understand the conditions that support it, and we can understand the conditions that liberate us from it. And we can train our awareness to gradually be shaped by our whole mind stream, shaped by the conditions that liberate us from suffering. So then the text goes on that the direct path is namely the four foundations of mindfulness. So if you've managed to find the text that Caroline linked to, or if you know the text goes on to say, what are the four? And the Buddha says, here monks, in regard to the body, a monk abides contemplating the body. And then this interesting little refrain that goes, abides diligent, clearly knowing and mindful, free from desires and discontent in regard to the world. In regard to feelings, one abides contemplating feelings, diligent, clearly knowing, mindfulness, free from desire and discontent in regard to the world. And then again in relation to the mind, in relationship to objects of the mind. So if you don't mind, I want to say something just about that little verse. There's a whole practice framework in that verse itself. So diligent is translating a Pali word atapi. And atapi comes from a root that means heat. And it quite often gets translated in English translations as ardent. Analio translates it as diligent, and it's an Alios translation that I've been using. But a more common translation is ardent. And ardent also comes from a root meaning hot, or a term for heat. And just to pause for a moment, and I don't know if this will work. We've got, I think, 40 plus people on the screen, but if anybody's got the boldness to say something, ardent, why is ardent being mentioned here? What's significant about engaging with the experience of the body, feelings, mind, and so on, with this quality of atapi, this quality of ardency? Anybody want to hazard a guess? The technology on Zoom, by the way, that there's a little hand that you can raise, and the hand gets you onto the first screen. I've got about 3 screens worth of people, and I can't see all 3 screens. But if you electronically raise a hand, it brings you to the head of the queue. So somebody very kindly texted, I think Lalita Raja, but unmute yourself and say something, Lalita Raja, if you were responding to the question.
Yeah, I was just for me, it speaks of emotional engagement and intentionality.
Yeah, And without making you spell out the obvious, what's significant about that? Why does that matter?
Well, you're not going to do anything without that.
Yeah.
There's no fuel.
No, I think it's as basic as that. Dharmashi nicely carrying on the hot metaphor, saying it's being fired up. I think all of that's true. Like, I think what you're doing with this practice, it's the kind of image that you get in the ox herding pictures, where you've got this little boy trying to move a buffalo. And I think to begin with, when you take awareness into experience, you're working with an enormous momentum of habit. And in a way, there needs to be enough energy moving into awareness, taking awareness into experience, for that momentum to have enough influence to start to shift the habitual momentum of our minds. So that the first thing that you're looking for is this quality of atapi, of ardency. And I think one of the kind of practical practice hints for that is, it maybe comes out a little more clearly when we're talking about another term later about sampajanya, but it comes from staying connected to why this stuff matters. You can't will ardency. The ardency comes from starting to get a sense that how we respond to experience a lot of the time causes suffering. And there's an alternative. And all of us in our practice have had moments of experience of what it's like when we're engaging with experience, when we're opening up to experience from more skillful foundations, to use that language. And it's staying connected to why this matters that creates that kind of energy, that kind of momentum. So that's the diligent. And then you've got this interesting little compound. So Analio translates it as clearly knowing and mindful. And that's translating another bit of Pali. And it's a Pali compound word, which is going to be familiar to most people, but it's interesting how often this appears as a compound. It's all very often the two terms together, and the two terms are sati, sampajanya. So the sati part gets translated as mindful, and the sampajanya gets translated as clearly knowing. But to be honest, I'm not sure that that is the best rendering of sampajanya. See if I can find my own notes on this. Sampajanya, one of the renderings of it is continuity of purpose. And there are different sort of readings of that. But one of Bante's comments on that in his seminar on the Satipatthana Sutta is that mindfulness is more than simple attention. It's more than simply attending to experience. So that the sort of sati is a receptive, non-judgmental, clear attending to what's arising in experience. But sampajanya is saying something different. Bante's take on sampajanya is that you need to be as clear as you can about what you're doing and why. So that this goes quite deep, actually. There's a chapter on this in Bante's treatment of the sutta that we don't have time to go into. But I wanted to mention, again, going back to Alan Wallace's book. Alan Wallace, writing about this, quotes a Pali text called the Milinda Panha, which is a text called The Questions of King Milinda. And it's a Buddhist monk in dialogue with an Afghan, like when Afghanistan was part of the kind of broader Greek cultural sphere. Now, it's one of the first records of a meeting of Eastern culture and Western culture, or sort of Buddhist culture and Eurasian culture. And one of the sequences and the questions of King Melinda is about the nature of mindfulness. So the responder describes mindfulness. And basically, he's describing sati and sampajanya. So he says that mindfulness, when it arises, calls to mind wholesome and unwholesome tendencies, false and faultless, inferior and refined, dark and pure. So if you don't mind, I'm going to suggest that that's the first aspect of mindfulness. It's a willingness just to be present to, available to, connected to the whole spectrum of our experience, whether it's wholesome or unwholesome, false or faultless, inferior and refined. And you get that contrast, you get that catalogue appearing again and again right through the Satipatthana Sutta. But is it Nagasena? Sorry, I've forgotten the name of the monk. But he goes on to say, mindfulness, when it arises, follows the course of beneficial and unbeneficial tendencies. These tendencies are helpful, it realizes. These tendencies are unhelpful. These tendencies are beneficial. These tendencies are not beneficial. And one who practices, he says, rejects the unhelpful tendencies and cultivates the helpful tendencies. So in a sense, I think from those two little phrases, you've got the shape of the Satipatthana Sutta. You're starting to take awareness into experience. You're just available to whatever arises. And that availability, that quality of attention itself is transformative. But the sutta goes one step further, and it asks us, so for example, in the mind section, it asks you to notice whether the mind is lustful or free from lust, whether it's aversive or free from aversion, whether it's confused or free from confusion. So all the way through, you're noticing the beneficial and the not beneficial, but not just noticing. The mind is starting to free itself from what causes suffering, and it's moving towards opening to establishing itself in what supports the arising of the skillful, the tendency to liberation. So that's, I think, the basic sort of shape of the sutta. It's certainly, I think, what this mindful and clearly comprehending the sati and sampajanya elements are getting at. And then finally, you've got this little phrase that talks about free from covetousness and grief for the world. And I think what that's getting at, we were studying in our community, we were studying the Arya Pariyesana Sutta recently. This is the Buddha describing why he decided to go forth. And he said he had this realization that he was impermanent, subject to decay and subject to dukkha, and realizing that he was trying to satisfy that by attending to experience that was impermanent, subject to decay and subject to dukkha, and realizing that his own dukkha would never be addressed by attending to objects that were impermanent. And what the sutta here is getting at, of moving beyond covetousness and grief for the world, it's a sort of shift in our attention. It's a shift from what we habitually respond to objects of attention into starting to look at the quality of the awareness itself and the quality of our relationship to our experience. So in this little phrase, what's being said is that we're engaging with this with enough energy for it to start to mean a shift in our experience. That one of the key elements in that is starting to attend to what our experience is like. It's a noticing what supports suffering and what liberates us from suffering. And that can be very, very simple, goes deep, but it can be as simple as we're not connected to ourselves. We use the breath to make that connection. And in that connection, we move away from the pain of disconnection into the relative liberation of connection, aliveness. So it can be quite a simple movement, but we're generating the energy, taking awareness in, understanding why that matters. I mean, this is, there's a famous aphorism by a Scottish football manager talking about football. He says, football is not life and death. He says it's more important than that. And I think the text is getting at that as well. This is literally suffering and the liberation from suffering. And if you start to understand that, attention moves from what we're habitually caught in, where we habitually look for sources of satisfaction, into taking attention into the quality of the awareness itself and the quality of our relationship to experience round about us. So that's the intro. That's the Buddha just warming up before he gets on to the Satipatthanas themselves. I'm aware I'm making a demand on your awareness and your attention. And what I was going to suggest was just doing a very simple little reflective exercise for a moment, just to get a bit of a flavour of this. Now, I'll explain it before we do it, but this is, I think, again, from the Tibetan tradition. And it's a little practice called the Four Remainings. And I'm not sure how deliberate this was, but it's a beautiful little encapsulation of what the Satipatthanas is getting at. And the four remainings are, first of all, remaining with the body with like a mountain. So just this sense of something grounded and stable. Remaining, to give you the full verse, remaining with the heart open, like a child gazing in wonder across the ocean, which is a little less technical than attending to feelings. It gets you a little bit of the flavour of it. Remaining with the mind as spacious as the sky, and remaining with the senses like a mirror. So just this lovely little mnemonic for where the Satipatthanas are pointing us to. So shall we sit for 5 minutes? The people on the first screen can nod or put a thumb up, that would be great. So just take a moment to let your mind clear a wee bit. And as we'll see in a minute, the practice in the sutta start off with the breath. So just letting your awareness find the breath, make connection with the breath for a moment. Then letting the breath connect us to our body. Having a sense of the breath coming in through the nose, into the chest, into the belly. And having this direct experience of the breath as sensations in our body. Awareness of the body breathing. What does it feel like in your body as we breathe in, breathe out? And that sense of the weight of the body on the cushion, weight of the body supported by the floor. This image of remaining with the body like a mountain. A sense of the body stable, grounded, rooted. What does that feel like? And staying in touch with that rootedness, this image of the heart open. Sense of curiosity, sense of interest, even a sense of love towards whatever arises in experience. Body grounded, heart open, a sense of the mind like a blue sky, sense of spaciousness, sense of clarity. Sense of the awareness not having any obstructions, anything that's clouding it. Just having an imaginative sense of that. What would that feel like? Then finally, senses like a mirror, just attending to whatever arises in experience. That grounded, open, clear awareness. Available to what we feel, what we hear, what we think. The idea of a mirror completely clearly reflecting what arises, but without being caught, without being changed itself. Just that openness available to whatever arises. Then when you're ready, it's bringing awareness back to the Zoom screen. I'm sorry to disturb you after that, but I'm going to say just a little bit more about this section of the sutta. I hope you get a little bit of a flavour of that. I think that's a wee bit of a prefiguration of what the sutta is trying to support, which is that sense of connection, openness, spaciousness, availability. I hope there was enough of a flavour to think, oh, that's kind of interesting. Well, some of you are very experienced practitioners, so you know where this is going. But so the Satipatthanas themselves, so it's setting up that quality of attention as far as we can. And it begins with the body. So over the next few days, I want to just spend a bit of time in each of the Satipatthanas, but I'm going to have to just slightly shoehorn the body in. So I'll deal with it maybe a little less fully. But the Majjhima Nikaya, the Pali Canon version of the Satipatthana Sutta, gives you a number of ways of taking awareness into the experience of the body. So it starts off with breathing, and then it talks about awareness of postures and activities. Then it talks about anatomical parts. So it's starting to be aware of the different components of the body. Then the 4 elements that make up the body. And then finally, reflections on the decomposition of a corpse, which I'm afraid we're not going to have time to go into in this session. The sutta takes you through that sequence. And one of the points that gets made about this, or point Analio makes, is that it's a progressive sequence. And I think the progressive sequence, again, gives you a bit of a hint about the process that the sutta is trying to take us through. So to begin with the breathing, and the breathing as a practice can go very deep, but on its simplest level, I love the mindfulness of breathing. And for me, it's like remembering I'm alive. It's like actually connecting with my, lived, felt, embodied experience. And when I do the practice on the whole, it's such a relief to feel awareness starting to go into experience. And this idea of the breath as a really visceral, embodied way of connecting to experience. It's a lovely kind of gateway in. And as you go deeper, the breath gets subtler and subtler, more and more refined, and your awareness follows suit. So it starts off with the breath. Then it goes to the postures and the activities. And basically that's sort of taking the mindfulness and starting to allow it to be more of a sustained, continuous sense of connection to ourselves and the world. So that the postures and the activities take the awareness of the breath off the cushion, starts to become a more sustained experience. The anatomical parts and the elements are starting to go a little deeper. And it's starting to put a question mark against the assumption that we have about ourselves as something fixed and something separate. You get it very beautifully with the elements. And again, to take the simplest example, in the air element, just the reflection is that your body, the self, is made up of elements that are not the self. So you breathe the air in. 1 minute it's air and it's world. The next minute it's breath and it's ourselves. And the next minute it's air and it's world again when we breathe out. So you've got this flow from world to self, from self to world. The whole thing is more fluid, more, to use the word, interconnected than our habit of seeing it is. So in both that analysis of the different bits of the body and that experience, this flow from world to self and back, it's just starting to say, look, the way you think experience is, the polarization that we make between ourselves and the world, if you start to look more closely, it doesn't quite fit experience. And then the sequence finishes off with the corpse. And I guess that's what the two things actually. One is it's a practice that works against the habit of craving. It's just bringing to mind that elements of physical experience are neither beautiful nor ugly, but it rebalances a sort of tendency towards craving. And it just brings into mind in the most immediate way this truth of impermanent, that we're part of an impermanent process. And you engage with this to the level and to the extent that it's helpful. So if it's helpful to start to take breath into the body, you engage at that level. If it's helpful to start to attend to this flow between self and other, you attend to that. If it's helpful to start to look a little more existentially at the impermanence of our own experience, then the practice goes there. And you've got, again, this progressive shape in the sutta that starts off immediately accessible and just gives you a framework where you can choose to look more and more deeply into experience to the extent that it supports that process of liberation. So again, that's the sort of shape of it. It starts off, the first of the practices is mindfulness of breathing. And it starts off very simply, very beautifully, with there's a cut and paste from the Anapanasati Sutta. It just takes the first verses from the Anapanasati Sutta and says, this is one way of attending to the body, and maybe it's the simplest. So I'm just going to read you a little bit. And the sutta says, how, monks, does one in regard to the body abide contemplating the body? Having gone to the forest or the root of a tree, one sits down, folds one's legs crosswise, sets one's body erect, and establishes mindfulness in front of oneself. Mindful, one breathes in. Mindful, one breathes out. Breathing in long, one knows I breathe out long. Breathing out long, one knows I breathe out. Breathing in short, I breathe in short. Breathing out short, I breathe in short. And then, on the basis of that, experiencing the whole body, I breathe in, I breathe out. And then, interestingly, calming the whole body, I breathe in, I breathe out. And in that little verse, you've got another pattern. You've got attending to things carefully enough to see the quality of it. Is it long? Is it short? What's it like? The whole body, you're using that first step into connection to open up to a whole field of experience. And then this paradox that on the one hand, you're connecting to it, and on the other hand, you're hanging loose to it. you're aware of the body, and then there's this process of letting go, just letting the body relax, letting the body calm, and resting into an experience that's bigger than the one that we usually cling to. So that's the time that we've got. If I'd had more time, more sense, I would have talked less and given a little bit more attention to the meditation. But next week, or sorry, tomorrow, realizing this is 4 days, those of you who are able to come, let's start off with where that little verse is taking us and just using the breath to connect to the body. There you go, a little doorway into the Satipatthana Sutta.
Thank you very much, Dhammarati. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so do come back tomorrow, everyone. Same time, same link, same place. Yeah, the email that Caroline sent out to you includes a resource page where we'll put the recording to this up quite shortly. Yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dhammarati.
And delightful to see everybody. Thank you.